There's two basic types: non-insulated frogs and insulated frogs. As far as operating across them, they're pretty much alike. As far as pushing electricity through them, they're different. The closure rails, the outside rails are the stock rails. And that completes the course in terminology. It's not really too difficult or too complex. What happens is when you have a non-insulated frog, you can pass these around and look at them. The frog rails are not electrically separated from each other. So when you apply power, or as I have on some sheets coming up, the other way around. If I say we're going straight, this point will not be making contact. All right. You got your negative here, because this is all one rail. You also have your negative out here. You got your positive here, and because you got one rail, you got your positive out here. That doesn't change when you change points. What does change is what you have on the inside two rails. When you set for straight ahead travel the through route, you'll have your negative over here. But because these are all connected, you'll also have negative up here. And this is where the term power routing comes from. Because essentially when the switch is set against the diverging route, the two rails are shorted together, there's no power, it's essentially off. Okay, let's change the points here and see what happens. Nothing's going to happen on the outside rail. That's the same as it was before. Likewise, this outside rail. What does happen is now... You got a short. No, you don't. Why do you have a short?
Well, because this rail over here would normally be minus, right?
Yeah.
You're determining the powers that get fed from the left, am I correct? Okay.
With non-insulated frogs, the convention is you always feed from the point end of the, of the switch.
I take my statement back.
So, yeah, it was all right to bring it up, but where you run into problems, and you can have a short, let's pretend with this is in a loop.
No, short.
Now you got a short. Because you got your negative rail coming across here, connecting to the positive rail over here. That's short. So that's why it's common to have a gap in the frog rails on switches with non-insulated frogs. It's unnecessary here if this doesn't go anywhere but just a stub end. If it's got power coming in on the other way, you do need a gap. In fact, those sheets that I handed out, those are mostly based on the Electrofrog Pico turnouts, which is a non-insulated frog turnout. So, another characteristic of many, particularly many older ones, non-insulated frog turnouts, you'll have your points are electrically connected. That Atlas turnout that I'm passing around is an example of that. This sheet here basically shows the two configurations. insulated frog switches and non-insulated frog switches and what happens. Now there's a big difference when you insulate the frog. Basically what you're doing is you actually have the frog rails split and jump it across so that they don't actually touch. Now this will also power root. Of course, the other difference too is that the points are seldom electrically connected. They're physically connected. Now, insulated frog turnouts are done a number of ways. Sometimes they'll have a little metal strip connecting these two rails and these two rails, or they'll just connect them using the points. Pico usually has that little tab underneath that goes on the side of underneath part of the stock rail when the switch closes. Those two Pico switches, John and others, you'll find the only significant difference between them is in the actual frog area.
And the jumper's on the bottom.
They're spot welded on the bottom, yeah. So what happens here? Okay. We've got the switch set for the diverging root. We have plus and minus up there. Well, what happens down here?
That's minus.
No, it's not.
Oh, it changes, right?
It does. Well, what's it change to? It's actually open. There's no voltage on it. Forget the gaps that are in here. Those are
right. Yeah.
because this point here is not connected to anything.
Oh, okay.
You're out there.
You don't have no in there yet.
Yeah.
Okay.
You don't have any. You don't have any.
There's no power beyond the.
Exactly
that
through
point,
the
right?
switch,
Okay.
right? And it's the same thing when you switch over. Again, this is power routing, but it's done a little bit differently. So you have to understand how the differences are and what the impact is. One of the nice things about this, in our situation here, with our loop around, we don't need that gap anymore, and we can get our minus around the loop. So with the Insul frog switches, you'll find in general, you'll have a lot fewer gaps to cut. You'll still have to have gaps for certain short circuit situations. Reverse loops will still require gaps. Section isolation still require gaps. But for backfeeding, you don't have to have the gaps anymore. Upstairs on the layout, for instance, almost universally, we backfeed. We put our feeds in on the frog rails as well as the stock rails. And that means we've got live rail all the way through, and we essentially bypass little tabs underneath. So if they get bent or don't make contact anymore, it doesn't matter.
Because we're getting power from both directions.
Yeah.
Basically, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything we get through the points is incidental, basically.
Okay.
It was like why you soldered track joiners instead of leaving just by friction, because they will eventually work.
Over time, yeah, they'll have...
same thing would happen with a switch, possibly.
Yeah. Also, when we were wiring up here, and anytime you're wiring, if if you're using these InsulFrog switches, you start at a switch point and follow its track until you either get to an end point or another switch point. And somewhere in there you've got to have a feeder. You don't need a gap. Again, unless it's for sectionalizing the layout. Like we have tracks up in the yard, we have groups of 4 tracks where we have them on a separate on-off switch underneath the end of the yard. So everything on that section would be isolated from another section, so you need gaps there. But some insulated frog switches will have a separate metal, oftentimes metal, sometimes the cheap ones are plastic. The actual frog is either a separate metal piece or plastic piece, and that is usually unpowered. So, in the case of a hand laid switch, in the case of the frogs in the gauntlet track upstairs, those were all solid frogs initially. And they had to be gapped because you had a left rail crossing a right rail. So what we ended up doing after we got rid of the relay and direction switching thing is we cut those and insulated them. Initially, we just left them dead. There's a short section of dead track through the frog. Now, for most of the locomotives we ran, it wasn't a problem because their wheelbase was long enough, and almost everything nowadays is all-wheel pickup. So that's a lot less of a problem now than it used to be in years past, when you'd have a diesel locomotive with 2 wheels on one truck picking up and 2 wheels on the other truck picking up from the other rail.
Like the old Athers.
Yeah. All hobby towns, too.
Or, yeah, right.
I got an old hobby town F7 power unit is exactly that way. It's got metal wheels on one side, plastic wheels on the other. But anyway, when you have an insulated frog, when you have a non-insulated frog, and you want to power it through, you can essentially make it into a insulated frog and have it powered. What you have to do is take your frog, bring it out, essentially to a switch, this switch physically operates with the switch machine. So that when you change the points, you also throw the switch, and you set the frog up so that it's powered the same polarity as the rail it's going to be running through. Now this can be done with any of those non-insulated frogs. The disadvantage to that is you essentially have to have a switch machine or switch motor on it with the auxiliary contacts. A lot of them have that nowadays. So, but again, this is an unnecessary step for us with the InsulFrogs. But that's tricky. That works for a solid frog that you want to power through. And the other thing too is when you do this, you also have to make sure you do your connections to your rails going into the frog so they'll have power too. Everybody happy?
No.
Okay, fine. What?
Why? Well, I guess the question, and I hope everybody else asks is the same thing. Why would I use a non-insulated frog over an insulated frog? When I'm reading, you're a lot better off using an insul frog than you are with a powered frog. But I read some article, the guy says he wants powered frogs for smoothness of operation.
Powered frogs wouldn't have the potential for the blockiness that these have. But the other side of the coin is there's a lot more complexity because you have to have a switch machine on them, you have to have the contacts, you have to have the wiring to that.